Hey folks, my name is John Elliott. I'm a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. And in this talk today, I kind of just want to address a few main ideas that I think are broadly applicable in a lot of different applied contexts. The first idea is that language classification and individuation, which we might also refer to as the language versus dialect debate, is a pretty inexact science. I like to use the word fuzzy to refer to it. Um, Despite this kind of fuzziness, and the second point, these classification choices that are made by linguists or other institutions can affect policy priorities for endangered languages and endangered language communities, and therefore the distribution of resources for the conservation of those languages. And therefore, this fuzzy art of language classification does really affect material reality for language communities. And I want to look at these issues through a particular case study wherein a governmental language conservation agency within the Paraguayan government prioritizes indigenous languages that are more highly endangered. But the classification scheme that they use, I argue, leads to ignoring specific communities that have highly endangered language varieties simply because of how the language variety in these communities has been classified. And therefore that different classification of the languages under scrutiny would lead to different priorities. This question about language classification and individuation, so trying to figure out what constitutes a single individual language, is really an age-old linguistic problem that we're all probably pretty familiar with to some degree or another. It's kind of like a Ling 101 type issue. But as Sisu and Good say, there is simply no easy cover-all definition of the term language that would satisfy all users and at the same time be scientifically rigorous. And we'll talk about why that might be, but this question of individuation is not really limited to linguistics. It's a fundamental kind of philosophical problem in a lot of different kinds of scientific inquiry. So as Bueno et al. 2019 say, a general problem for scientists is how do scientists individuate the things they investigate and thus count them as individuals? So we have a kind of standard working model and some terms that we use, wherein we have individual languages, which are defined as maybe a shared set of mutually intelligible linguistic behaviors. Within an individual language, however, there might be multiple dialects, which are defined in opposition to each other. So the language has the boundaries that are based on mutual intelligibility, but it might include multiple smaller individual units that we refer to as dialects. Now, above the level of an individual language, we can talk about larger groupings like language families at lots of different levels. But a family is a set of non-mutually intelligible languages which are related in the sense that they descend from a common ancestor language. And so when you're looking at a group of related languages, like a language family or like a smaller unit, we might use terms like variety or languoid to refer to specific individuated linguistic entities, specific systems, regardless of their internal composition or variation, and without reference to their external relationships to other varieties. In other words, we use terms like language variety or languoid to avoid having this kind of discussion about whether something constitutes a true language or whether or not it is like a dialect of another language. But there's a lot of problems with this model that I think most of us are familiar with and probably have engaged with to some degree or another. One problem is that with the exception of truly monodialectal languages, dialectical languages, a language as a term is then really more of a classificatory structure which unites and is composed of dialects. And therefore a language is not so much an individuated linguistic entity, but is itself a kind of classificatory grouping, and that it groups together related varieties on the basis of an assumption of their shared mutual intelligibility. Right. But that criteria of mutual intelligibility, as most of us know, is not very straightforward. There's like a common problem that most people are aware of the existence of dialect chains or dialect continua, which is where you have strings of dialects, related varieties of language, where mutual intelligibility decreases in a gradient fashion, usually with distance, such that you cannot take the whole dialect chain and create language groupings within it that do not create borders across mutually intelligible varieties, therefore kind of negating the purpose of having the definitional boundary of the language in the first place, right? So the takeaway that I want to have from this discussion is first to remember that individuating languages, the problems that it presents are generally about boundaries, right? It's figuring out where the boundary of an individual language is, which allows us to talk about a single individual language. But more broadly, what I want us to think about is that where you have like easily individuated low-level varieties, something like a fairly homogeneous local dialect, that might be something kind of like a natural type in that it really actually exists, and it's pretty easy to draw a boundary around it and think of it as an individual entity. At the same time, at the much larger level, a family is also something more like a natural type in that we can say that it's all of the individuals that compose a family are related and descend from a single origin, but that between this upper higher level of category of a family that brings together everything that is historically related and the individual varieties within it, the categorical and classificatory structures which mediate between these two ends of the spectrum, like language, are not really natural types. They are kind of just abstract analytical categories. In a sense, then what I'm saying is that the reason that we can't define or have a problem defining what a language is in the context of this discussion is because that category, that thing, that type of thing does not really exist. In other words, where you have a spectrum of related varieties at the level like a large family, the way that you can classify and group together degrees of similarity at a level below the level of a family do not naturally create specific naturally existing degrees of similarity, right? It's always going to be kind of gradient and fuzzy. Also, when we have this discussion, we need to talk about kind of a different model that is out there in a lot of folks' minds in the way that people kind of colloquially might use the term language versus dialect. And this is especially relevant in places that have experienced like European colonization. So there's kind of a model outside of linguistics in which a language is typically centered on some idea of a written standard as opposed to a dialect, which is not, right? And this is different from the idea where like a dialect is something that is part of, or that a language is composed of multiple dialects, right? And this distinction between a language being focused on like a written standard and dialect is not being focused on a written standard may in fact actually capture some differences in language practices and linguistic ecology that do bear on the nature of variation. So when you might talk about in Latin America, people will refer to like the Spanish language, but they might refer to indigenous languages as indigenous dialects. That distinction may actually capture a meaningful difference, right? Especially in the sense that written standards do allow for some kind of greater individualization and concretization of single language. The problem with it, of course, is that distinction has been used in a pretty discriminatory fashion throughout history. So the distinction tends to register standardized European languages power as being kind of legitimate and indigenous languages as illegitimate, such that, speaking an indigenous dialect as opposed to an indigenous language, that term dialect is used because of associations with like rural poverty or low education, right? And so because of this distinction between the two terms in the latter dialect term is kind of used derogatorily in some contexts, speakers of smaller languages may seek legitimacy for their language by seeking greater standardization and individuation of their local variety, which kind of makes them more like languages and less like dialects in this classical sense. But understanding that this is the model of the distinction between language and dialect that a lot of folks have, or something kind of like it, is important because this distinction bears on the interpretation of that linguistic classification discussion, the languages composed of dialects model, and that communities might take their variety being labeled a dialect rather than a language as somehow being delegitimizing. So finally, before I get to the case study, I want to say that linguists attempt to make these classifications based on empirical research, and we talk a lot about using mutual intelligibility as a defining factor in whether or not we count an entity as its own separate language or part of or dialect within a larger language grouping. The reality, I think, is that although there have been complex, rigorous studies of mutual intelligibility for some related languages in some families, most of them kind of like standard European languages, most of the classification has been done in other regions, especially in places like the Americas, parts of Oceania. Um, a lot of that classification has been made in the absence of really good, rigorous testing of mutual intelligibility, and it really is kind of impressionistic. So, even if mutual intelligibility was not so problematic and not as complicated as it is in practice, I think the reality is that we need to recognize the fact that in a lot of cases, we actually don't have the kind of good, rigorous data about mutual intelligibility that we would need to make those decisions, even if on a conceptual basis, that was actually a foolproof standard, which is Finally, we need to recognize that within this discussion, there are power differentials, such that linguists, when they make these classificatory decisions, can kind of insist, based on, like I just said, pretty limited evidence, that two, for example, indigenous languages or indigenous language varieties are mutually intelligible enough to be called the same language. We can put that in a publication, and it's going to carry some kind of authority. Governmental agencies might use that classification, like they do in the case that I'm going to show you. But we can't use those same criteria to go in and like tell the EU that they shouldn't count Danish and Swedish as separate languages, right? Because there are different contexts in terms of like who has more power and authority. Within the Inlet family in Paraguay, this EE family is a small indigenous language family spoken in Paraguay in a contiguous territory in the Paraguayan Chaco. It's a small family in the sense that there are no big like stark divisions. There's not like different branches that are wildly different from one another. The morphophonological and lexical variation is not that great. Even a non-specialist could probably look at some basic data from languages across this family and recognize pretty quickly that they are closely related. Attempts to list out and classify the languages of the EE family, what was previously known as the Mascoyan language family, are mostly pretty bad and based on very limited knowledge through the 20th century. And it's not until a publication in 2003, Unruh College 2003, written by a speaker of one of these EE languages, listed out the following 6 languages that, and actually in the paper were described as not so much individual languages, but linguistic nuclei. That we kind of have something that does map pretty well to reality. So Unruh College listed out Inlet Norte and Inlet Sur here as part of a Western branch, just simply because they're more like each other than they are from the remaining languages of the family, Sanapana, Angaite, Guana, and Inlet, which constitutes something of an Eastern branch. Although I'll say for any historical linguists here, we really have not kind of sussed out this distinction very well. These distinctions are pretty tentative between the Eastern and Western branch. But Unruh College described this classification system as a set of linguistic nuclei as opposed to individual languages because the family is known to be composed of one or more dialect continua. And the actual formal realities of the different varieties within the family are quite fluid. I want to pick out one of these groups, the Inlet Sur, to look at in a little bit more specifically. So ancestors of most of the groups that today are identified as or identify themselves as being part of the Inlet Sur, the ancestors of those folks belong to one of 5 or 6 primary bands around the late 19th century. And of these 5 or 6 bands, 3 or 4 of them settled in an Anglican mission at a place called Maclawaya around the beginning of the 20th century. And this single residential unit, Maclawaya, was kind of central to the development of a more concentrated Inlet Sur identity from these smaller group identities that existed previously. But at the same time that these Inlet Sur folks were kind of forming this more concentrated singular identity through the Anglican mission at Maclawaya, various other closely related groups, Southern Inlet peoples, were migrating to a totally different part of the Chaco to work at camps by the Paraguay River and formed a separate group identity as the Chanahuatzam, which literally just means like those by the river. Now, Chanahuatzam, the language that the Chanahuatzam people speak, is identified generally as a variety of Inlet Sur. The descendants of the folks that worked in those factories are identified usually by the government as Inlet Sur, and many of them identify themselves as Inlet Sur. Although, again, like I said, that identity is a little bit fluid in the way that people talk about their own like group identity and ethnic identity. But they also identify as Chanahuatzam. So whether or not that identity as Chanawatsam is part of a larger Intlet identity is not super concrete. Um, in the literature, however, it is treated as a variety of Intlet but it is the variety of Intlet that other Intlet speakers are most likely to identify as being a wholly different language from their own. They will say it is a different language. There is not a lot of documentation on this particular variety, but there's a significant number of Chanawatsam features that are more like the languages of the eastern branch of the family than they are like Intlet and the other Western language. However, when it comes to the vitality of this particular variety, it's a interesting point. So Intlet inclusive of Chanawatsam, if you group in Chanawatsam as part of Intlet as a language grouping, Intlet is the third least endangered by speaker percentage of those 6 EE languages. However, the vast majority of Intlet language loss has been in Chanawatsam communities because, again, they have a pretty distinct history from the rest of the Intlet population. So let's talk about how that plays into language policy choices within Paraguay. So a little bit of background context. In 2010, a short-lived liberal government introduced some new legislation that created an institution in the government called the Secretariat of Linguistic Policy, or the SPL. Its primary goal was to promote the use of and development of Guarani in new domains across the country, but the 2010 law also included some basic legal protections for speakers of other indigenous languages, and also some provisions for programs for indigenous language conservation. So the creation of this Secretariat for Language Policy included the development of a sub-branch called the General Directorate of Indigenous Language Documentation and Promotion, or the DGPLI, which exists for the purpose of documentation projects, producing text, developing language materials, and consulting with communities on issues of maintenance and revitalization. This institution has really very limited resources. I mean, it's arguably kind of like an appeasement organization. It's kind of there to look good. It's not really funded well enough to be super effective. But the folks within the institution, I think, are really committed to their cause. But because they're very poorly funded and resourced, they engage in a kind of intense language conservation triage. So within those languages in the Intlet family, you do have one language, Wana, which is only spoken in a single village and only has 3 living speakers. And so that has therefore been the top priority since the inception of this institution, is working on language documentation and revitalization measures with these handful of Wana speakers. Sur is, across the 6 EE languages, is the next to lowest priority EE language for the DGPLI. Just above Intlet Norte, which is kind of in a league of its own because it has several thousand more speakers and a near 100% speakership rate. But what this means is that Chanawatsam in this classificatory scheme is kind of rendered invisible. So because Chanawatsam has been considered a dialect of Intlet Sur, it is rendered invisible to the government despite its association with a unique group identity, a unique linguistic history, a high degree of endangerment, and a lot of like formal factors that make it pretty different from the other varieties of Intlet Sur that are less endangered. So the main point in all of this is basically that if Chanawatsam were listed as a separate language under their classification scheme, which is not unreasonable based on the available evidence, and certainly not unreasonable based on the challenges that we've already talked about in terms of individuating and defining what constitutes a single language, right? The fuzziness of that question to begin with. If it were listed as a separate language, it would likely be the most highly endangered EE language after Wana, and therefore would be a higher priority and probably would have already gotten some attention from this governmental agency that it is not getting at all, right? So to finish up here, I think that there's a few practical takeaways from this case study that I want to leave you guys with. One is that in general, policymaking institutions are unlikely to engage directly with the complexities of language classification and individuation, right? When they're going to listen to linguists, they mostly just want a list. So the fact that the publication that is being used by this governmental agency to define the 6 languages within the EE family specifically says that those languages are nuclei as opposed to strictly individuated linguistic entities, doesn't really matter, right? They want a list of languages. And so by the same token, if policymakers are working on language classification in collaboration with communities, which hopefully they should be, the information that they're going to get is not going to separate out linguistic criteria from other kinds of social or cultural or political criteria, because when you ask communities, they are not going to rely strictly on linguistic criteria, right? They're going to define things for themselves, and it's going to include social and cultural and political criteria. So anytime that we are reducing the variation and complexity across a large population to a simple list of languages, we're always going to be engaged in a bit of an oversimplification. So if we're going to do that, and we know that it's going to have impacts in terms of who gets priority, who gets looked at by institutions, why would we not at least consider factoring in the practical impacts of your decision into how you go about that process of oversimplification? That's kind of the main idea I want to leave you with. But similarly, I think that the example of what the DGDPLI has done shows two particular kinds of problems that arise when you take a lumping approach to this issue. The first is that lumping might lead to high need communities being lumped in with lower need communities, as is the case with the Chanawatsam and the Inset Sur, and therefore the needs of that higher need community kind of get obscured because of who they're getting lumped in with. And second, lumping approaches can complicate the political relationships involved in distributing resources by creating more intergroup decision making. And therefore, although splitting might lead to kind of a thinning out of resources because they're spread more thinly across multiple groups, you might actually have the opposite problem if you lump a little bit too much, in which case you complicate decision making to a degree that it's hard to get things done. Anyway, I really look forward to your questions, and I think that this discussion, raises a lot of interesting questions about the relationship between kind of our theoretical approaches and theoretical understandings of this issue, and kind of our desire for objectivity in our classifications, and how that relates to the actual practical outcomes and practical results of the classification choices that we make. So thank you, guys.